Good afternoon and welcome. We are so delighted to host a conversation on a very important book and research by Amanda Phillips. The book is called Gamer Trouble, Feminist Confrontation in Digital Culture, and it was published by the NYU Press in 2020. If you didn't get your copy, I will drop the link in the chat of the publisher, and then you can probably find it at any of your local bookstores. I'm Dr. Melissa Hafaf. I'm the director for the Gender Justice Initiative here at Georgetown in Washington, D.C. We are a cross-campus effort that supports and nurtures research as well as programs related to everything intersectional gender justice. And today we are very happy to partner with various organizations, including the DC Public Library, the Women's and Gender Studies Program, as well as the Women's Center to bring this program to you. So thank you to our partners for their support. And before we start, I will give you a few rules for this webinar and some information. So first of all, you can ask questions at any point of the conversation to our speakers by using the Q&A function instead of the chat. You can use the chat for the love, the reactions, the comments, but we'd rather have all the questions in one place. You can find it easily. And also we have Zoom captioning that you should see and activate at the bottom of your screen, as well as one ASL interpreter with us, who is Aviva Ben-Shishrit. Welcome, Aviva. Thank you for being with us today. And our program will be in two parts. First, we'll have a conversation of about 30 minutes between the moderator and the author. And then you'll have all the time to ask for questions and hopefully get beautiful answers from our scholars today. And now let me introduce you to the two brilliant feminist scholars of the day. Professor Phillips is an associate professor in the Department of English and Film and Media Studies at Georgetown University. They write about sex, death, identity, and politics in video games, with a particular emphasis on centering the insights of queer women of color, feminism in the study of technology. Their interests more broadly are in issues of racial and gender justice in and around technoculture, popular media, and digital humanities. They're co-editor of ADA, a journal of gender, new media, and technology, the Queer Trans Digital book series with NYU Press. And you can find their publication in Feminist Media Histories, Queer Game Studies, Games and Culture, Digital Creativity, Debates in Digital Humanities, the Fembot and the Fembot Collective. And you can find information on their website. I will also drop the link in the chat. Amanda Phillips received their PhD in English at the University of California, Santa Barbara, with an emphasis on feminist studies. Welcome and thank you for being here with us. And the moderator for the conversation is Professor Soraya Murray, who is an associate professor in the Film and Digital Media Department at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Professor Murray is an interdisciplinary scholar who focuses on technology, science, and visual culture with a particular interest in contemporary art, film, and video games. Thank you both for accepting our invitation. We are so honored to have you and to learn from your work today. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I just want to say thank you so much for this invitation. I'm really happy that we're finally able to properly celebrate this book, which I think has made a wonderful contribution to critical game studies. So we don't have much time, so I'll get right into it. And I wanted to kind of start with your intellectual background. I mean, many of us, as we were chatting before we started, like many of us come out of very different disciplines. A lot of critical game studies scholars, especially of your age, my age, and older, we came out of programs where game studies wasn't actually the focus. It was something that we brought to whatever discipline we were coming to. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit for everyone about your training and about like how you came to critical game studies from your background. Who was your advisor, that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been an English major, I like to tell people, since high school, I think. It was one of the things that, as a young person, right? I love to read, I love to play video games, and I love to write. And so English was like a space in which, not so much the video games in high school, but that I could really sort of like pursue my interests in writing, in sort of like understanding text and culture. And so when it was time to apply for grad programs, it felt like the most sort of like natural progression for me. And in fact, the person who was my advisor in graduate school, Rita Rayleigh, she's at UC Santa Barbara still, she came to my undergraduate institution as a visiting professor. And taught a class on electronic literature, in which there was a unit on games. Right, it was a lot of different stuff that we did. This was back in the days of like code poetry and like flash poetry and those sorts of things. And when we got to video games, we were reading all of this theory about games, and as a gamer, I was actually kind of offended by some of the things that people would say about like games. And I won't name who we were reading, but it didn't sit right with me. And so it was really a place where I was very intellectually excited. And when it was time to apply for grad school, I kept in touch with Rita over time. And I got back in touch with her, and I was like, so if I wanted to do this for graduate school, where would I go? And she helped me pick out a few places, but she was also like, you could come here to Santa Barbara as well. So I ended up in the English department at Santa Barbara, which for, folks who aren't familiar, we have people on my dissertation committee included Alan Liu, who is one of the sort of like luminaries of early digital humanities. Rita Rayleigh is also, one of those folks. And so I was very well trained in the literary from a digital angle, right? And it was a cool training, right? So I read all the books, right? I got all the literary theory, but then they had a very strong specialization in digital texts and how to apply the interpretive skills that we develop in English classes to technology, right? To literature, to digital poetics and that sort of thing. I was the only person at the time doing video games, but it was, again, one of those sort of like natural progressions where learning about how to think about technology and digital texts helped me sort of develop a particular approach to gaming. And then Santa Barbara also has a very cool and very strong feminist studies program, and they had an emphasis certificate that you could do. And so while my PhD is in English, I did the things for the feminist studies certificate, which included taking a bunch of classes, different foundation classes, and so on with feminist studies. And then sort of like tying in my dissertation to those themes. And so those were sort of like where all my interests converged around video games, politics, right? Feminism, critical race studies, that sort of thing, and then literary study.
That's a pretty amazing origin story for your critical game studies. Yeah, thank you. So you kind of touched on this in your answer a little, but I wanted to ask you directly. So as a critical game studies scholar, like what really bothers you? Like, what do you feel like today is the most fundamental concern that through your work that you're always grappling with, even if topically things may change?
Yeah. Oh, that's such a good question. I think for me, and I think this is something that comes out in the book a lot, I get really frustrated by really polarized good versus bad discussions, right? So all of the figures that I look at in my book, I think are somewhat compromised as games, as characters, as politics, right? And for me, I'm always interested in like quote unquote like bad things, in the things that we shouldn't like. I'm interested in arguments that may seem like they have really clear right and wrong answers, but kind of like getting into the messiness, right? Part of why I called it gamer trouble, because I'm interested in the troubled places, I guess. And like a good example, like to sort of like ground this in a concrete example, of course, is the chapter that I have on Bayonetta and Portal, right, where I look at them as feminist objects, feminist characters, where at the time, people were very, very clear on Portal is this amazing feminist text because we have this woman in gaming and she's wearing clothes, right? She's not sexualized. She's fully dressed. She's competent. And then on the other hand, you have Bayonetta, who's not, right? She's very over the top sexualized. And people were very clear, like, this is bad feminist object, right? And for me, I'm a little suspicious. I'm always suspicious about those kinds of positions. And when I actually played through these games, one of the things I'd like to do is take it beyond that sort of like surface representational level, where what you're looking at may indicate one thing, but when you actually play through Portal and you actually play through Bayonetta, like structurally, they are very different kinds of games, right? So the entire like conceit of Portal is that she is an ambiguously racialized brown woman in a prison jumpsuit as a lab rat in this facility in which a literally white woman computer is holding her captive, right? I'm just like, it's just such a, like, when you put it that way, it's like a really absurd thing. And I was reminded of, old discussions in feminist media studies, right? Like around the Alien films, for example, where folks were pointing out, like, Ripley's an awesome, badass heroine, but all she's ever doing is fighting against a queen, right? And so it was like this really like old clash of women against each other, that like people were celebrating because the main character was fully clothed, right? And for me, like, the racial and gender politics just didn't add up there. Bayonetta, on the other hand, right? Yes, she's sexualized, but there were a few folks, particularly in the popular criticism, that pointed out that she's very campy, that she's very queer in a lot of ways, and that, and I think I'm forgetting the name of the columnist. I'm so sorry, who wrote this, but he wrote a column like that was about her sex being a weapon, right? And it's like, of course, she's fighting against literally the Catholic Church, or a weird, bizarro world version of the Catholic Church. And in that context, it makes sense that sex becomes a weapon because of the Catholic Church's history of sex negativity, of restricting women's sexuality. And then when you look at the actual gender politics of it, she's teaming up with a group of witches, right? And it's this like old 1970s lesbian separatist fantasy of like this group of women versus these priests, witches versus priests. And for me, that had a lot more possibility, right? As a feminist text. But also going back to these sort of like old tropes that I find really interesting. So I don't like to give those really hard right and wrong answers to these things. Bayonetta is still problematic. Like, as much as I find redeeming about her and really interesting about her and productive about that game, like, at the end of the day, yes, she's absolutely a sort of like sexist icon in certain ways, that contribute to a particular kind of trend of representation of women in games. But I think it's very simplistic to sort of like put her in that box and say like Bayonetta is a bad game, because there's so much more going on.
Yeah. And I think like part of what's so exciting about like the thematic choice of your book of trouble, like kind of staying with the trouble, is that I think it encourages like a complex engagement with these, troubling, but also like perhaps like opportunities, in these characters where something happens that could be really interesting, where it can invite a complex reading, so I mean, your book in many ways, like, I feel like it's really about running toward the trouble and instead of running away from it, or just saying, this is bad game, no one should play it, or this is a good game and we should all celebrate it, like that these things are complicated as we are, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, like you make, a critique of even the academic field as it's forming of games, of critical game studies, right? That there are certain ways in which we police borders. We insist on saying some things are good, some things are bad. One thing I wanted to bring up to you in regards to that is your decision to use really mainstream games, which isn't actually a small choice, right? This is something that, like in my own book, I felt like I had to justify. Because I think the trend at the time that we were writing was to perhaps, like, if you're going to be activist in your writing, feminist in your writing, that you need to focus on the smaller games that aren't getting that attention because the big games are sucking up all the air in the room. So can you talk about that a little bit, your decision to go for these mainstream major games?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, part of it, of course, is a matter of preference and taste, right? I have very my taste runs towards the popular, and so those are a lot of the games that I end up engaging with. But the other thing about that is I think it's really important, and I think about this not only in my research, and of the fantasy that we have that like people outside of academia will read our research, but I also think about like my teaching, right? I want to be playing the games that my students are playing because I want to be able to talk to them about them, right? Because I think there are lots of interesting things about popular games, even when they fall into old tropes, even when they fall into problematic politics. In some ways, that can make them even more interesting objects, for folks, again, who are engaging with games in their everyday lives and maybe not thinking about them in a particular way. This has, I mean, you know, I try to cultivate my own community of game scholars who understand, right, like what I'm doing. But I have received pushback. I remember I was in a job interview once, and the person in the interview said something like, you know, our students, they play a lot of Call of Duty, they play a lot of Halo, they play a lot of these games. Like, how would you? This is a literal question in a job interview. How would you steer them away from playing those kinds of games to play better games? And I was like, fix my face. And I was like, I wouldn't, like, you know, it's a you can't force people to be interested in only the things that you're interested in. Like, at some point you have to meet people where they are. And so, you know, I like to play games based on recommendations. I like to play games based on what my students are playing. I've had students recommend games to me that have like really changed my mind about a lot of stuff, right?
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, and I just like to play what everybody else is playing, and see, you know, where the interesting stories are there, and the interesting critiques, analysis, politics.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's really interesting for me about teaching, and I think occupies like a huge part of your critical project in your book, is this like pushback against the idea that technology is just neutral and free from bias, right? And that I think one of the beautiful things about your work is that it extends that idea into games, you know, and that there are also sites in which the struggles for recognition and power take place, that these are complicated representations, that it isn't only about representation, but other aspects of games as well. It seems to me that it's very useful, and also for the moment in which the book came out, very much like pushing back against some predominating trends in games that would try to excise that conversation from like the proper, you know, center of critical game studies. So can you talk about that like decision? I mean, perhaps it was a very natural one for you, but you know, it's certainly one that is very significant, and that all of us at some point have had to kind of make about what we're going to be about in critical game studies.
Yeah, I mean, some of this, I mean, I hear you sort of like invoking ludology versus narratology in a particular way, which, you know, for folks who aren't familiar, is this sort of like argument that happened in game studies about whether we should be looking at games as games themselves, as like rule structures and interactions and those sorts of things, versus games as story and narrative. And it, you know, this is, I think this is something that I do a lot in my personal life. When you tell me you have to like choose one or the other, I was like, I want all the things. Give me all the things. Right. And that's true of the technology, the game structures, the representation. Like, I want to talk about all of it, because it's a hopelessly interconnected system of meaning. I was a science nerd in high school. I hung out with all the nerd boys. I did computer science. I built my own gaming computers, right? Like, I was very interested in material technologies, and what they could do. And so, you know, when I ran into that sort of like STS, or science and technology studies, angle of game studies, I found it really fascinating and like vibrant, right? And it wasn't even game studies. I think actually my first encounter with it was Friedrich Kittler through my qualifying exams, reading about the phonograph, right? And like all of these old technologies that had, you know, to his mind, like had an impact on the message. I'm mixing Kittler and McLuhan, but Kittler was the one that I found more exciting. And so like, as somebody who, again, tinkered a lot with computers, I wanted to be able to talk about that in games. I wanted to be able to understand rules and interactions. And then I already had a pretty strong understanding of representation and narrative. So again, in my sort of like greedy way, I just wanted to like talk about it all. But that can be really intimidating and messy. And I think one reason that, and one thing I actually appreciated about the position that we need to focus on developing a vocabulary to talk about games themselves, is that, you know, words matter, terminology matters, and there is a certain amount of like focus and dissection that you have to do to in isolation to understand different parts of a system. I'm not good at isolation, right? My brain thinks sideways. I'm always like making outward connections. And so like that kind of thinking doesn't come naturally to me. As much as I appreciate it and as important as it is for developing a vocabulary for the field, at some point you have to make connections. And I felt like that was where I had a strength, right? I'm able to pull all these threads together. And like maybe to some people, what I've assembled is this like massive jumbo, I don't know, like a yarn ball or something that's all tangled up. For me, it's like a beautiful weaving project or something. I just like to bring everything together and put it in conversation with one another, in ways that sometimes, you know, doesn't have good closure, sometimes doesn't have clear answers, but that's okay.
Yeah, maybe not easy answers, right?
Easy, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we've kind of organically gotten here already, but yeah, one of the things I was really interested in this book was its modeling of a particular kind of methodology, and that had to do with your politics around citational practices, which you mentioned, you know, explicitly, but I think that's so important. And like one of the things that was always really important to me, and that I saw in your work as being very central, was that you weren't only citing people who, like, you know, there's this kind of rule in academia about how you're only supposed to cite up, like you're not supposed to cite people who might still be PhD students, right? And so can you talk a little bit about that, like about, you know, how it is that you went about kind of making this argument when really a lot of the like most exciting critical game studies was coming from people who were kind of like a little bit behind, you know, behind us, like in terms of, you know, coming out of PhD programs, getting their first academic jobs, getting their first publications, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So my thinking about citation politics actually originated with the chapter about dick wolves and about the conflict in game studies, specifically around Grand Theft Auto, where I saw a lot of like scholarship that was excusing problematic representations because the games were very interesting mechanically and technologically. And I started to read all of those articles and write really pointed critiques about them, right? Like, how can you say that like this mechanic in which, and it was, you know, there's one section in the chapter where I talk about a sequence of events that players put together in Grand Theft Auto where you can hire a sex worker to regain health as a mechanic in the game. You can also kill people to steal their money. And so people were putting the two together where you would sleep with the sex worker, give her money to get your health back, and then kill her to get your money back, right? Extremely like reprehensible sort of like sequence of events that game scholars were really interested in as emergent play, right? As this is not the game being evil and setting you up for this really like sexist thing. This is players like just figuring out different sequences in the game. And I'm like, this, like, that's the problem. And so when I presented the first draft of this chapter, where I was critiquing my colleagues, some of whom were much higher ranked than I was, my dissertation committee was literally like, you can't do this, right? You can't come out, you know, for lack of a better term, because I'm thinking about Grand Theft Auto, you can't come out guns blazing, right, at, you know, powerful people in your field. And I was like, why not? First of all. And then secondly, I was like, okay. And then at the same time, I was taking a feminist studies class that was called colorblindness across the disciplines, where we were thinking about colorblind politics and the ways that they manifest in our different disciplines. One of the books that we read for that class, it was an amazing class. It was taught in conjunction with other graduate seminars across the country, I think coordinated by Kimberly Crenshaw. It was like a super, super cool seminar. One of the books that we read was Claire Hemming's Why Stories Matter, which was about feminist theory and the ways that feminism as a discipline tells stories about itself. And one of the things that Hemming suggests, or one of the citational strategies that Hemming uses in that book, is to not name names. And she does this in part because scholarship is a community responsibility, right? A single author writing an article has to go through peer review, probably goes through some kind of writing group with their colleagues. There's editorial oversight, right? Like there are layers of responsibility that multiple people have over a piece of scholarship that makes it, frankly, our everyone's responsibility when bad scholarship comes out, right? And so I really, that helped something click in my brain. It gave me a little more compassion for the folks who were writing. And it also gave me a concrete strategy for thinking about how do I call my community in without making individual people necessarily feel defensive. So that was where I started to think about citational politics. The other sort of like layer, of course, is citing the people that you're not supposed to cite and making sure that women's names are in your book about video games, making sure people of color are in your book about video games, giving credit to the bloggers and the folks who write news article criticism about games and the fans that were really inspirational to me in terms of their readings, right? Fans are some of the best close readers that exist. They do close reading better than a lot of academics, frankly. And I wanted to make sure that like that labor was acknowledged, that, you know, my book had people in it that might not ever get cited in an academic book ever again, even though they're the ones that we're reading and sort of like thinking about the things that they say. And it led to some like interesting exchanges as well, right? Because we have different sort of approaches to citation and incorporating, you know, other people's work in academia than we do as fans, for example. And so I contacted some of the folks that I worked with, particularly the Sage, who did the fan video about Mass Effect that I write about in the very last chapter. We had a really great email exchange about that video and how it inspired me to think about FemShep as this particular kind of weird figure that like everybody treats as a singular character, but she's actually like extremely different for everyone. And she was just so excited that someone recognized that in her video. And that like, she was like, this is exactly what I've been trying to like articulate through my fan video. Right. And so, yeah, like I was so happy to be able to cite her in my book. It's like someone who inspired me to think about the stuff that I, you know, later put in conversation with academic criticism. But, you know, it matters that we acknowledge that our thoughts come from elsewhere, right? That we are constantly being inspired by the people around us, by the blogs we're reading, by the tweets you're seeing. And, you know, it's important to like put that in print.
Yeah, I totally agree. And you brought up FemShep, so we haven't really talked about that chapter at all. It hasn't come up too much, but can you talk about that chapter a little bit? I think that it was a really interesting example of taking what was clearly a somewhat mechanical problem of the game itself, but then how it became a kind of metaphor for a larger problem of a very shallow approach to diversity and inclusion. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, game designers are often programmers at heart, or are often working closely with programmers and computer scientists who are always thinking of ways to streamline processes, ways to make things efficient, ways to like fit everything onto a little disk. because otherwise, you're going to sell this game that needs 3 discs to get everything. But what that ends up doing is that it never occurs to anyone that like maybe this main character should just be a woman. And let's focus on these assets first. What they do is, okay, we have a man. Do we have enough space to add a woman? Right. And it's very, again, all of these old tropes start coming up in this book, and it's very like weirdly Adam and Eve, where you're literally in the sense of this computer animation that they're doing, literally using the skeleton of the male avatar to animate the female avatar. And so you have what they call like reskinning, right? You literally put another skin on top of this body, and it resulted in some really weird things. They changed very little about their animations to go from the male avatar to the female avatar. For the most part, that's fine. And a lot of times when animations get gendered, femininity becomes this extreme, like swishy sort of like caricature. I just showed that video of the most recent Batman game where somebody switched the Batman and the Catwoman avatars. And so you have Batman who's like, doing all the Catwoman animations. So I'm not saying that like exaggerating the gender binary is the answer, but then it resulted in these weird quirks where it was very clear they weren't even like thinking about a woman as this character or this character as a woman. One of my favorite examples of this is that like, and I can't do it because I'm in my office chair, but like Commander Shepard has this super butch like squat that they do when they're sort of like talking, or you sit legs wide, man spreading while you're listening to your shipmate talk about their day or whatever. And fans notice that like when they dress their FemShep up in a dress and she's man spreading, like you can see all the way up her skirt, because nobody thought that maybe this character should sit different ways depending on what they're wearing or depending on their gender expression. And so it's just these really interesting, weird things. The other fun one is the example that I have of when Commander Shepard is sparring with, I'm forgetting the guy's name. Anyways, super hulking dude who's like voiced by Freddie Prinze Jr., I think. And they're like sparring, and the FemShep avatar is very small. The male Shepherd avatar is also big and hulking, and so they reach this point in the fight where like Commander Shepard flips this big dude over his shoulder like it's nothing, which is unrealistic. But when you see the tiny skinny female Shepherd avatar do that, you're like, something, James Vega, thank you, chat. Something is like not right here. It's a very fun moment of bending physics.
Okay, we're coming close to the point of turning to audience questions. So I just want to give people a heads up to please use the Q&A, and I'll start looking at those in just a minute. But there were a lot of questions in advance when people were signing up for this talk about teaching. And so I wanted to ask you about cultivating new troublemakers, right? So how do you teach your students to embrace the kind of kaleidoscopic complexity of games? How do you teach them to sit with the trouble when they're often fans and games might be really precious to them? And maybe at first they're thinking, that you're trying to destroy that for them.
Yeah. So I used to tell students this in advance on the first day of class, and then it showed up on one of my evaluations one time, so I stopped. But I'm in some ways luring students in with the promise of video games to teach them feminist and queer and critical race theory, right? I let them know on the first day, like, we're going to talk about politics. We're going to go deep into these texts in ways that like you may find uncomfortable, that you may resist. But I found on the whole, like Georgetown students are really game for that sort of thing. And so I've had a good experience here with our students and with their willingness to sort of like dive deep into culture. For me, it's important, again, to meet students where they are, to follow their desires and really to not shame or like, I don't know, try to steer them away from those, but to like work with them, right? To say like, okay, you find this really interesting. Let's try to apply some of these concepts, right? Because in some classes I have them, you know, playing games and reading feminist theory or queer theory that's like not at all about gaming. I'm trying to like apply those concepts to these texts. So yeah, like for me, again, it's really important just to like meet them where they are, and to like look at the games that they're interested in, and to try to like guide them in that way, and expose them to the kind of richness of theory that sometimes is difficult for students. I teach a lot of really dense, difficult articles in my classes. But since we're playing video games, I feel like they're willing to like go with me on it, because I don't know, maybe there's like a reward at the same time or something. So that's sort of my approach is just to like go full in, lean into the pop culture, lean into the games, but then also, you know, give them the knowledge at the same time.
Thank you. One last question about your book, and then I'll move to the questions from others. Is there anything that didn't make it into the book?
Oh, there was a lot of stuff that didn't make it into the book. One of the things, and so I mentioned, you know, being at UCSB with all these digital humanities scholars, I actually had digital companions for, I think, all of the chapters of the book that didn't make it in, right? Because it would have been a lot to sort of like think them out, and sort of like flesh them out for a publication platform. And digital publication platforms they're there and they're good, but I had a hard time conceptualizing how to make my digital stuff work with the book part of the book. But one of my favorite things that I did as part of my dissertation research, in part with money that I got from the American Council of Learned Societies to finish my dissertation, was I made a fan video about Bayonetta. And it was a particular genre of fan videos called slash. And slash is where you cut film together in such a way that it suggests a queer relationship between two characters that are otherwise probably not romantically attached in the game. So I made a Bayonetta fem/slash video about Bayonetta and her arch nemesis Jean, who's like her witch sister or whatever. And it debuted at the Queerness in Games conference, but I never found a way to like tie it into the book. We can pop the link to the video in the chat later.
I loved it, and I hope you'll share it with others.
Yeah, I'll put a link to the video in chat. But like thinking about the ways that I like smash these objects together, you know, it's a music video set to Aerosmith's song "Ain't That a Bitch," right? And so I'm like intentionally sort of like cultivating this these conversations, right, about Bayonetta as this really misogynist object, and misogynist game, but also like complicating it with like, if you read it with these queer dynamics in mind, it's actually much more interesting. If you read it with like the religion angle, it's a lot more interesting as well. And so, you know, again, sort of trying to get into trouble, but also indulging my like fan desires.
That's right. That's right. That's another dimension of everything as well. So yeah, I hope that people take a look at it. It's really amazing. So we got 3 questions so far. The first, I don't know, can you see them as well? Shall I read it out or?
Yeah, go ahead and read it.
Okay, as a criminologist, I find the gamer subculture very interesting. Could you please talk about some of the social norms prevalent within this subculture based on your research? And the second part being, according to the UMass Lowell study, a sizable percentage of female gamers reported that they were treated with less respect. How can one characterize existing gender bias or sexist and hostile attitudes against female gamers within this subculture? And if so, what can be done to reduce these kinds of behaviors, etc.?
Yeah. So thank you so much for that question. I will preface this by saying I'm not trained like as a social scientist in any meaningful sense of the word. So my approach to that is through language and through conversations, right? So I have a chapter in the book where I cover these online harassment campaigns against women in gaming. And specifically, I'm not talking about Gamergate, right? Gamergate was something that reached mainstream media. So it was a really infamous incident of basically wide scale harassment against women and people of color in gaming culture. That happened as I was finishing this project, right? And so I had this entire chapter about an earlier episode called, two earlier episodes. One was called Dick Wolves. The other one was called Fat Princess, right? And they were about these sort of like gaming culture incidents in which mostly feminist critics were critiquing game culture for exactly this kind of like sexism. And the response was a widespread, often coordinated harassment campaign against them. So I'd look at this on a feminist blog that has been since shut down, called Shakesville. And they were at the center of both of these, right? Because the feminist critic who ran this blog was a gamer, and occasionally she would run into things and write a blog about like how sexist it was, and gamers would lose their minds and say like, how dare you try to ruin our fun by sort of like inserting these politics. And it's worked its way up the chain, right? Like we have this impression that gamers are these young boys who have no self-control and they're just wild on the internet, like spewing hate speech everywhere. But when you actually like look into it, Dick Wolves was in part spurred on by two adult men who ran a webcomic empire and who are still very influential in gaming culture, called Penny Arcade, right? They have a convention, they have their webcomic, they have a media empire around games, and they were the ones at the center of this controversy, right? And so one of the things about these sort of like earlier episodes of harassment against women and people of color in games is that they were sort of, I don't know, the canary in the coal mine for something like what happened in the 2016 election, right? With the alt-right in particular. There's been a lot written since on Steve Bannon, right? And how he started out as someone who owned a gold farming company in gaming, and how he recognized, and he's quoted, right, as saying that he recognized this sort of latent people power in gaming culture, right? This sort of like turbulent anger and feeling left out, and these sorts of things that I write about in my book. And he wanted to harness it for a political movement, and that's part of what happens, and that's part of how the alt-right sort of like bubbles up to the surface is through gaming culture. In terms of how to curb, right, this kind of harassment, there are lots of folks who work more in the area of online interactions than I do. I would mention Kishana Gray in particular as a scholar that you could look to, who is a criminologist, a trained criminologist as well. So I recommend looking into her work. But really, corporations, like gaming companies, have to start taking more responsibility for this behavior, right? They're getting rich off of the passions of the people on their platforms. And you can say the same thing for Twitter and for Facebook, right? All of these conversations about how social media needs to figure out, or social media companies need to figure out how to better regulate the speech on their platforms. I would say the same is true for gaming companies as well, right? Like if you're making lots of money off of this, you are in part responsible for the impact.
Okay, other questions. How do you feel like game studies has changed even since your book came out? Do you have any favorite recent articles that have come out in conversation with your book?
Yeah, so it's still a little early for the things to be in conversation with the book itself. But Soraya and I have had great conversations about like sort of feeling like Gamer Trouble came out at this moment, sort of like at the very first of like an explosion of books that have centered around feminist theory, around queer theory, around critical race studies. And that like game studies, you know, I used to have to teach when I wanted to teach politics, it would be you're going to read this non-gaming article and we're going to apply it to games. But now there are tons of articles and tons of books that engage with politics and gaming in the same text, in really rigorous ways, in ways that understand the theory as well as the games, which was often one of the things that we struggle with, there would be folks who were really, really strong in feminist theory, but they didn't quite understand games. And so it felt a little off when you would read those analyses. But now we have folks who have been trained in both, and who sort of like understand both in a particular kind of way. And it's really exciting time. I think the two books that I actually came out right at the same time as Gamer Trouble, that I absolutely love and that I think are doing very similar things. The first is Chris Patterson's Open World Empire. It's a fantastic book. And sometimes I've told Chris that like we feel sort of like brain twins in some ways, because we have very, very similar like lateral ways of thinking. We both like to sort of like stir up trouble. He has an interesting chapter about racial representation that it does very similar work to what I'm doing with Bayonetta and Portal, right? Where he's sort of like arguing for like, well, let's try to understand racial caricature in games in very different ways, right? So I highly recommend that one. And then Tara Fickle's The Race Card, which is a really cool book with a deep history, right? And thinking about the legacy of Asian Americans and the sort of like perception in the US of Asian Americans and their relationship with games, right? So from sort of like the gold rush card playing, sort of like those stereotypes all the way up through esports, right? And our sort of like techno orientalist impressions of Asian gamers today. So those are two books that I think do really fantastic work and that are very much of the same moment as Gamer Trouble, that I was really proud to like, have come out at the same time.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I who knows in history, in time, what will happen, but I feel like people will look back on this particular moment as a moment in which a lot like became possible in critical studies. Finally, like the traction was there.
Yeah. And of course, led by Soraya Murray's, right, on video games, right? That had come out a few years prior. That was also like really inspirational for all of us.
Yeah, and I stand on the shoulders of others, right, who did the work, so much work, Anna Everett and like, all of these folks who did it when it was really new and strange for people to accept, right? Okay, more questions. We have a little time. So, oh, you mentioned you've gotten game recs from students that ended up really surprising you. What's your favorite example?
There have been so many. I think the one, I wouldn't say that it surprised me, but what surprised me is how much I got into it was Hades. Oh. And Hades is a really beautiful indie game that is in the spirit of other games that I play. In the sense that it's what's called a permadeath game. So you play it and it's randomized every time. And when you die, you have to start all over from the beginning. And over time, through multiple deaths, right, you unlock more items that make you more powerful. But Hades also incorporates this really compelling story where every time you die, new dialogue options open up when you go back to, so you play, I'm forgetting his name again. I'm super bad with names. But the main character, thank you, Zagreus, is the son of Hades, and he's trying to escape the underworld and leave, right? In pursuit of his mom Persephone, who is also left. And so every time you die, you go back to Hades' palace. And everybody's there like, oh, you didn't make it again this time, right? And there are new options that open up. You have multiple like love dialogues that you can have. And it's a really charming game with beautiful artwork that I went into a sort of like Hades fugue state during the pandemic where I played it for hundreds of hours, I'm sure. I haven't looked at it. I haven't played it in a while, but I went on a bender and I think I have like 200 or 300 hours on that game. And it caught me in a way that I wasn't prepared for. So many students said, you have to play Hades. You have to play Hades. And I was like, oh, okay, whatever. One night I downloaded it and then I was like, whoa.
How do you balance fan reading of games with the evidence provided in the work itself? i.e. be more interesting to read a game through a certain lens, but balancing that with potential lack of evidence that is the intended reading or context?
So I don't know. When I said that fans are some of the best close readers, I actually mean that in the sense that they often pay attention to details that I completely miss, right? And so I actually think fan readings offer a kind of evidence that like I do not always like. It's just not always something that I notice. Um, One of the things, I mean, when we talk about balancing fan readings, what I often sort of like hear in that from sort of like from the academic side of things is that you can't let your feelings get in the way of how you are understanding a text. And that there's this sort of like prohibition on too much feeling, which is bullshit, right? Like we know that. We know that as scholars, like the only way you subject yourself to 10 years of graduate study is if you are very passionately involved in something emotionally, right? And so I have appreciated the rise of things like affect theory. So now we have like theoretical terms for talking about our intense emotional attachment to objects, but that have also made it a little more acceptable, right? To engage in that kind of like fanishness. But in terms of balance, I mean, I don't know. I don't know that I like balance that much. Sometimes I just like to go deep into the fanishness.
Yeah. I have a good question here. How do you approach a conversation with someone that is not willing to compromise, specifically in the theme of gender and racial prejudice in games?
Yeah. So there are different versions of this conversation, right? One version happens in the classroom, in which there's a power dynamic there. And like at the end of the day, I'm the professor, and there's a certain like gravitas to my opinions that make it, what I say goes. I think it's important not to abuse that dynamic, and to again, not to shut people down. But there's a way in which like having those exchanges with students publicly, even if I don't change their minds, and I think especially when I don't completely shut them down, I know everyone else in the room is paying attention to that, right? And I know there are students there who don't know how to respond and who are looking for my response. And so, for me, it's important to firmly disagree and make sure my point of view is out there. It's not always meaningful to get into a back and forth, right? This is something I've learned on social media as well. I used to be a keyboard warrior, like the best of them, right? And like if something got me hot, I was like ready to go for hours back and forth. I'm too old for that. And like in multiple senses of the word, right? Like too much anxiety, too much like time, too much seeing like too many people on the internet who literally just want to shout at each other. And so again, like I have to be realistic about my capacity and my ability to change minds. And at some point you just like, you do you, I do me. We're not going to fight about this on the internet. In the best cases of those, right, you do change someone's opinions. But if someone is not willing to compromise, there is no amount of evidence. There is no amount of emotional appeal. And I say this as someone who, and maybe this like in some ways informs my approach to conflict and scholarship and my willingness to sort of like go into the sort of like controversial areas, right? Like I grew up as a queer kid in an extremely religious evangelical household, right? And you sort of like develop a certain sense of like some people aren't going to change, and you can't let that sort of like stop your work. Mm-hmm. You can't let that stop your passion. And so, I'm here for the students who need to hear me and who want me to help them, help give them sort of like more ammo for the fight, if you will. Mm-hmm. And it's okay if I don't change everyone's mind.
Right. I used to think of it, different details, but I used to think of it when I was growing up as limits of the imagination of some of the people I'm going to engage with. Right. What are your thoughts on using game design curriculum itself as a practice for exploring identity and subversion? Any work you might know of and recommend? Oh, and then favorite GameCube titles.
Yeah, yeah, my
there,
little GameCube there. And
yeah.
Okay, so the first question about game design. So I actually teach at Georgetown. I teach a game design for social justice class. And it's specifically, and I tell the students in these exact words at the beginning of the semester, in this class, like by the end of it, you are going to make a shitty game about social justice. And I say this because it's a class for non-designers. It's a class for non-programmers. It's in the film and media studies in the English program, right? So I'm not working with, I mean, there are programmers who take the class and who end up, you know, doing some interesting things. But like the primary thing that I'm interested in is the social justice part of the education. And there's a way in which, because games are complicated systems, right? They are simulations of systems that have many parts. They're really great for thinking through social justice issues. And so my goal in that class is to get students to think about social justice as a structure with moving parts and, you know, interactions and consequences. And that's how I use game design in those classes, not in a trying to like replicate the AAA structure of games, but in getting to think about how do we map out complicated interactions. And so that's how I use game design. A lot of students do take that as a sort of like identity exploration thing, which I think is great. It's a good opportunity for them. But I also know, you know, especially following particularly the queer and trans game development community, right, that those sorts of identity games can only go so far in terms of communicating complicated social justice structure. So there have been a lot of trans designers in particular who got sort of like sick of cis straight people playing their games and thinking that, look, oh, I suddenly understand what it means to be trans, right? So there's only so much a game can do in communicating experiences. And I also try to let students know that and of that critique of so-called empathy games, right? Mm-hmm. That it can be a tokenizing experience. It can be an experience that can sometimes encourage people to not do the hard work, right? I've played this game and therefore I understand your experience. In terms of GameCube games, I will say that my very favorite one is Metroid Prime. And Metroid Prime was actually the game that I wrote about in that undergraduate class on electronic literature that made me want to be a game studies person. And I was convinced as a 20-year-old that like I was going to write a book about Metroid. Right, like that was my thing. And that's another thing that never made it into the book was Metroid. And you know, I'm at peace with that. But I will say Metroid Prime is the game that kicked off my passion for analyzing games. And I wrote I did a digital project on the like the index in the game where you would download all of these entries on the different creatures and etc.
I want to read that paper. Okay, we just have a minute. So, okay, when teaching students who come in with media/critical backgrounds, right, but aren't huge into games or the very online culture that comes with them, do you have challenges imparting some of the mimetic and referential culture that often informs and creates games?
Yeah, so I establish a policy in my games classes that we always explain what we're talking about, right? So if you mention a game as an example, you have to stop, tell everybody what it means. If you use an acronym, you have to explain what it means. And so that's one way I try to get around that. I will say that the students who are not gamers who come into my intro to game studies class often have the best experiences and the coolest stories and give the highest recommendations of the class. So my very quick anecdote that happened when I was a graduate student at UCSB, there was this woman in the class who had never played games before. She was really anxious about it. And I told her, you know, you'll be fine. Halfway through the semester, there were these men in the class who were talking about this boss. They were playing Cave Story and they couldn't get past this particular boss. And I'm watching this woman sort of like listening to them behind her. And then all of a sudden she just turns around and she's like, all you have to do is shoot his wheels off. And then he goes down really easy. I was like, yes, this is this is my this is my people right here.
Well, it seems like we're out of time, unfortunately. Thank you so much. I'll bring, I guess, Melissa back on again.
Hello. Hi again. Thank you so much. What a rich and enlightening conversation. I myself not really a gamer or anything, and I learned so much. So thank you for this. Thank you to both of you. Thank you, Amanda, for sharing this book with us. Thank you, Professor Murray, for moderating this so brilliantly, and thank you to all of you for attending today. I'd also like to thank our partners at the DC Public Library, the Women's and Gender Studies Program, and the Women's Center for co-sponsoring this event with us. We'll have more coming up. This conversation has been recorded, so you will all get a link to it next week. So stay tuned. Thanks again. Have a beautiful afternoon, and I hope to see you all in person at some point in the future.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a beautiful day. Thank you, Aviva. Have a great day, everyone.